as we await a major ruling from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals on Donald Trump's claims of immunity in the federal January 6th case. The court's decision, it could come at any minute. There is right now a chorus of voices picking apart each of the arguments used by Donald Trump to fend off the cases popping up across the country, challenging his place on the 2024 ballot. It is an existential threat to the one thing that Donald Trump sees as the way out of all his legal problems, winning the presidency. In a brand new brief to the Supreme Court, alongside other prominent lawyers like George Conway, conservative former jurist Michael Ludig calls for the justices to take the 14th Amendment very literally. They say, quote, because Section 3 emerged from the hallowed ground of the Civil War, this court must accord Section 3 its fair meaning, not a narrow construction. Mr. Trump incited and therefore engaged in an armed insurrection against the Constitution's express and foundational mandates that require the peaceful transfer of executive power to a newly elected president. In doing so, Mr. Trump disqualified himself under Section 3. Regarding Trump's argument that the so-called insurrectionist ban can only be applied after a candidate has been elected, Ludig and others say this, quote, that would deprive voters of the ability to make a truly informed decision because they could not know if they were voting for someone who cannot serve. And it would risk chaos as courts litigate whether a newly inaugurated president is disqualified. At the same time, the country needs a president to be indisputably occupying the office and making enormously consequential decisions. Then there's Trump's argument that the 14th Amendment does not actually apply to presidents. A group of historians with expertise in the Civil War say, not so fast. In their brief to the Supreme Court, they cite reams of evidence from the architects of the 14th Amendment. They say, quote, decision makers crafted Section 3 to cover the president and to create an enduring check on insurrection, requiring no additional action from Congress. All of this for the 9 justices on the Supreme Court to consider. Oral arguments are on February 8th, and officials across the country are hoping that the Supreme Court settles the matter once and for all. Just today, officials in Illinois rejected a bid to take Donald Trump off the ballot, saying that they lacked the authority to make the decision. And that is where we start today with former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman, plus national investigative reporter for The Washington Post, Kara Letting. And here with me at the table, former lead investigator for the January 6th Select Committee, Tim Heaphy, joins us now. Tim Heaphy, in the flesh, thank you so much for being here.
Nice to meet you, Alicia.
In person. This decision out of Illinois, what does it mean?
It's a mixed question of fact and law. So whether or not the former president engaged in insurrection is the factual question. And then the legal question is, so what? Does it then lead to disqualification? This is yet another fact finder, Republicans on this Illinois Board of Elections, that on that factual question have found he engaged in insurrection, that his actions on and before January 6th actually rise to that very high bar of causing, inciting insurrection. Now, they did not resolve the legal question sufficient to remove him from the ballot. They believe that they didn't have the authority to do that. It should go to the courts in Illinois, and I believe that it will now. But it's yet another voice, Alicia, now repeatedly, state officials, special counsel, the Select Committee, all of whom are finding there's factual basis that the former president of the United States incited an insurrection.
I got to say, Carol, that chorus of voices loud in my own head, what does it sound like to the former president? How much time is he spending thinking about the 14th Amendment challenges?
Well, every time there's a news alert on his phone, I could probably bet you, Alicia, that Donald Trump is looking down to see exactly what people are saying about him. You know, he is a no news is bad news kind of guy. He likes to be at the center of news, and he'll be watching this. I think what probably will be the most painful for supporters of Donald Trump is that the individual in Illinois, the retired judge who concluded that there is a preponderance of evidence, overwhelming evidence, that Donald Trump engaged in inciting and encouraging and aiding and abetting an insurrection, is a Republican who said, you know, if the Board of Elections in our state decides they are going to rule on this matter, you know, Tim is absolutely right. That judge and that panel said this should be left to the courts. But that Republicans said as well, that if the state election board is going to decide it has the authority and make a decision, then he said Donald Trump should be struck from the ballot, the primary ballot in March.
And that, Harry, not exactly a win for the former president.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. Look, it's sort of a perfectly schizophrenic opinion. It's 20 pages that this former Republican judge goes through. And then he says under state law, Illinois Supreme Court, I'm at my advice to you, actual election board, says that you're not supposed to resolve constitutional questions. And woo, do we have constitutional questions here? So that's the reason. And 8-person, 4 R's, 4 D's, took it from there and all decided not to disqualify him, although it now comes to the courts. It's just one more pattern. By my count, there's about 7 or 8. It's kind of like Maine, where you first had a hearing officer, but then it went directly to the courts. Here it went to an administrative body. I think paramount in the U.S. Supreme Court's view and kind of sober reflection for next Thursday, the 8th, is this worry that there's going to be, unless they stop it, a real kind of crazy quilt pattern of different results and processes across the nation. And the Constitution doesn't necessarily preclude it, but man, it's a mess. This case, though, is wild and getting wilder by the day.
Wild is a good word for it. Tim, I want to play you some of the argument that Trump's attorneys made today. Take a listen.
This is a political question that is not capable of adjudication by the board or really a court. The 14th Amendment, the third section of the 14th Amendment, was meant to be enforced by Congress.
There was never an admission, and there never has been an admission by President Trump, anything near that January 6th was an insurrection.
So I want to take that in 2 parts. The first part going to you, Tim, which is this idea, this argument from his lawyers that the 14th Amendment was meant to be enforced by Congress.
Yeah, a common argument in Supreme Court litigation and in proceedings of constitutional questions is essentially stay out of it, right? You don't have to decide this. It's a political question best adjudicated by Congress or executive branch, not you, jurists. It's interesting that it's yet another voice where the president's lawyers are saying to courts, not yet, don't decide, don't address the merits. It's a consistent pattern of trying to stay out of court, of trying to avoid the adjudication of these important issues. Whereas you have the special counsel, you have the plaintiffs in this case saying, no, resolve this. This is important. There'll be chaos if it's unresolved. Right,
because let's just walk through it. Let's walk through the argument that someone like Ludig is making, right, which is, OK, you allow him to proceed. He is on the ballot. There is an election. In the case where Donald Trump is elected as president, then all of a sudden it gets kicked to Congress, which also then potentially invokes the 20th Amendment. You're having a conversation about whether or not the vice president serves. That does seem
potentially chaotic.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Both sides here invoke the prospect of chaos and sort of atmospheric support for their arguments. The Trump lawyers are saying it'll be chaos if he's disqualified from the ballot. Judge Ludig in the brief says, conversely, it'll be chaos if you leave him on because it will leave this question to Congress. And if he wins the election, if he's the nominee and he wins the election, then there will be uncertainty. So both sides are sort of wrapping themselves around the prospect of uncertainty and chaos in support of their position.
Well, and then you have, Harry, the argument from Trump's attorneys saying Trump never admitted that January 6th was an insurrection. It would seem to me that doesn't change the fact that it actually was an insurrection. And then in all of these fact-gathering expeditions, you have a number of courts who have come to that same conclusion.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter. It is or it isn't. But now that's a question of federal constitutional law. And what they have in front of them in the case is a determination by a Colorado trial court judge that the respondents, the challengers, just filed today, their brief saying it's not clearly erroneous, but it's a little funky to adopt that as a finding that applies across the board as a federal constitutional matter when it is made by just one single trial court. I think Tim's point is exactly right. Both sides are claiming chaos. And Ludig is a very straightforward textualist piece done expertly by Richard Bernstein. I just want to say one quick thing about the historian's brief. brief that you mentioned.
Please.
One of the arguments out there is he's not an officer, and they have a really expert dismantling of that argument, focusing on Jefferson Davis himself, the president, who believed that he, in fact, was disqualified, as it turns out, under the 14th Amendment. It's an elegant historical analysis and the sort of thing to attract, especially the right wing of the Supreme Court, and might make that one exit route all the harder to take. They've got a difficult path, whatever they adopt.
Well, let's stay on that point here, Harry. Here's how Deadline legal blog writer Jordan Rubin explains one of the points that the historians made about Section 3. To explain why the section nonetheless covers presidents, the historians point to congressional debate at the time of the amendment, in which a senator questioned why presidents were being excluded. The historians recalled that an influential backer of the amendment noted that the section incorporated the president, replying, "Let me call the senator's attention to the words or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States." The initial senator admitted his error, and no other senator questioned whether Section 3 covered the president, the historians wrote. Can you just sort of pull back the curtain for us, Harry, on how a piece of evidence like that is considered as the justices contemplate their rulings?
Well, look, I think that, first of all, it's really, as I say, elegantly done. That person you're referring to is sort of the Larry Tribe of his day, the kind of author and expert. And there's also, as I say, Jefferson Davis himself saying this applies to me. If they're I think, will be very serious about text and history. You have Luda being text, but then that's how they'll interpret it based on the history and structure of the 14th Amendment. And a piece of evidence, or several pieces that they bring to bear, the historians, I think is just going to be hard to discount. So it means that, they'll have to keep looking at possible other solutions. But this one that causes the least damage, in a sense, saying the president is not an officer, looks to be damn anti.
6. Relinquish what remains of the Allspark.
So who's the insect? You? What? Who's the insect?
Protect you. They were defeated on our world, and we will defeat them here.
This was just a diversion. Security teams bring up. Rabbit, she's already inside. Deeds. Give me an update on that reserve. What's readiness? What was his name? What was it?
Evac, sir.
Right, evac.
She's right in front.
We are facing a heavy, sustained attack. They appear to be after the Allspark. General!